Hello and welcome. Prashant Krishnan is Director of Safety, Security, Quality, and Business Continuity at EDP Renewables and is based out of the US. The company is a global leader in the renewable energy sector and the fourth largest producer worldwide with projects in over 28 countries. So they build everything from wind farms to solar parks to offshore wind projects. And so, getting Prashant on this show would give us an insight into what the world of renewable energy is looking like, apart from what the activists are fighting for, what the government policies are, and what is his role in advancing the role of renewable energy in the world today. My name is Venu Gopal Nair. This is episode 78 of My First Job, the podcast that covers engaging career journeys, and every single one of them is full of twists, turns, and insights. My name is Venu Gopal Nair. I'm the host of the podcast and CEO of Ideascape Communications, an advertising agency into branding, creative, and design. So settle in, sit back, and enjoy the conversation. Prashant, welcome to the show and thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much, Venu Mama. It's actually a pleasure to come and talk to you here. Yeah, I was so surprised with the question because it's been a while since I've thought about it. So I had to think a little bit about, the journey. Because
Okay.
as we were talking previously, it's been a while since I've been in the US, nearly coming to the midway point of my life, in some ways between growing up in India and then in the US. So,
Okay.
so thinking about the job it took me back a few years to say the least.
Yeah.
My very first job actually was, believe it or not, at Center for Science and Environment. Do you remember that magazine Down to Earth?
Yes.
So I used to work. I was a volunteer there. That was my first
Okay.
job. Yeah. So Sunita Narayan was the CEO, the head. She was big into environmentalism and kind of the pioneer when it came to India's role in environmentalism. So I had just gotten out of college with a civil engineering degree from Nagpur,
Hmm.
and I was actively applying to go to different countries. I mean, I think the goal was to go to the UK because I love football or soccer, right? So I was thinking at the time, it'd be great to be in a country where everyone plays and I can play, and
Yeah.
so that was the plan. But the UK turned out to be extremely expensive, and funding was very difficult at the time. So gave the GRE, did okay-ish, did not do all that well, did okay. And in the meantime, I had to kind of build up my resume and, so that I could apply for scholarships, so that I could travel.
Okay.
And that's how I ended up at Center for Science and Environment. And my background being engineering, they assigned me this particular role around decentralized wastewater treatment systems. So one of my, it's I don't know why, but like from day one, it's all my role has been within water and working on water. And even
Okay.
now, even though I don't do a lot of water-based work, it's always around me in some ways. So we were doing wastewater treatment systems, and we were trying to build them decentralized. Because at the time in India, I don't think it's changed much from that point on. A lot of the pressure comes on the water treatment system, centralized water treatment systems
Right.
for clean water, and that's why everyone in India now has, RO systems inside the house, and you do a lot because our infrastructure from that perspective, a lot of people.
Right.
The thing with India is you've got to handle a lot of people. It's not a small population. So
Hmm.
the idea was we used the German model at the time, and I
Okay.
believe it was made by like this little consortium out of Germany that focused on decentralized water treatment systems.
Okay.
So took the design from them and then started working with CSC. Did a lot of work down there. It was really funny because volunteers would be paid, like $100 kind of thing, 100 Indian rupees back in the day. And so I keep telling, it's kind of like that as a badge of honor, saying, like
Uh,
my salary in terms of US dollars was nothing, compared
yeah.
to
But you
How
were learning. I guess that's one aspect of it, which was, it's almost like, yes, it's a small amount, but you pick up things that most of the people would not even be aware of at that particular point in time.
that's so well said. So that was it, right? Like, so for me, it was, I looked at it as a way to learn, right? Because
Yes.
we had come out of college, and
Mm.
especially in college, you theoretically you come out quite strong, but it's very difficult to practically put things into play.
Right.
Implementation has been the hardest thing that I've noticed in my career. Is okay, you've got all these ideas, but actually, given financial markets, given how the world works, how do you put this all into play? Because a lot of times, like I've even seen our projects are well funded, but people don't want it, right? They're not ready for it. So
Right.
you have to change the psychology also on that one in terms of, for people to accept certain projects. So having a wastewater treatment system in your backyard is not
Mm.
something people want, you know.
Yes.
So there was an entire psychological side to it where I mean, I was, straight cut engineer. I was like, man, I'm giving you all the benefits. Like, why don't you listen to me? Why don't you should be saying yes to me? And they didn't, right? So it was
Yeah.
a really, really nice journey. I had some really good mentors there. And that's the
Okay.
one thing, like throughout my professional career, I've been very fortunate, like very blessed that I've had very good mentors, very good managers and bosses throughout. I mean, I can't really pick on anyone. Even the ones that were tough on me, they were tough for a reason,
Right.
and really helped me to get to this point as to where I am right now. So yes, I did that. Came to the US, finished my grad school, and then my first true job, first in quotes real job, was at a boutique environmental engineering firm. They're quite big in the world now. They're called ERM, Environmental Resource Management. They have offices in India also. Actually,
Okay.
one of the offices was in Gurgaon. So when mom and dad used to live there, I would try and see if I could just go and check what work they were doing.
Right.
Yeah, so I started working there as an environmental engineer, a staff engineer. So I was doing a lot of
So you just
contamination.
checked it out. It wasn't in response to a job. Uh, you were not responding to an ad or anything. You just went to the place to check it out.
I had a job in the US, but they had an office in India. So I just went to go meet colleagues
Okay.
there. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And the way I got the job was also, it was all over the place because it was the summer of '07. So it was the summer of '07, and everyone in my class was getting internships. My roommate was Indonesian and very, very close friend of mine. And so we were all like, different parts of the world. We were all living together. And he gets an internship with an oil and gas company, and he's like the
Okay.
first one to get an internship. And I tried every which way possible, to find an internship, and I couldn't find an internship. It was really difficult. So slowly and steadily, but then by the tail end of it, I ended up with about two or three. So that was good. Like I could choose, and I chose ERM based out of Houston. So then I moved. I was in College Station, which is the university I went to. I went to Texas A&M. So it was an hour and a half south of College Station. So I basically moved down here, and ERM was very kind to me. They gave me an apartment, like a corporate apartment to stay in,
Okay.
and it was right next to the office. I would walk to work, which is
Okay.
very strange. In Houston, that's a very strange thing because it's so hot
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you're feeling the heat right now, even up in Denver. But it's
Yeah.
so hot here. So people would like look at me and be like, "Why is this guy walking on the street?" No one walks. Everyone drives. So that was a funny little anecdote from back then. And
Uh,
so yes, I just worked with them through the internship, and the internship ended. They made me a full-time offer and said, if you finish school, um, uh, this, when you finish school, why don't you come back and work for us full-time? So that was
okay.
so my last semester. I actually came in as MS. I had thought about doing a PhD at A&M. That was my goal, was to do a PhD, but um, in 2007, it was weird because academia had no money at the time, at least in my
Right.
department. It was not funded that well. So my professor was like, no, go, go, go. You have a job that's better for you right now. And then within a year, the world switched, right? Like
Yeah.
the economic crisis happened and everything changed. And
Right.
everyone ran back to school because that was the safest place to be during those days.
Yeah.
It was just a strange time in some ways. But I was very fortunate again that I got in right in the beginning of that
Right.
of that transition. Like Jan 2008 is when I started working, So yeah, so I worked with them for about 4.5 years. Lots of, I mean, I had some of the best experiences of my life there. Just because I
So,
was,
what do you do? Can you outline a few, let's say one or two projects or something that you were, because I think at that point, getting renewable projects off the ground itself would have been fairly tough. So, what are the initial teething problems? Can you go back to that time and give us
yeah,
some
yeah.
instances?
So I think the thing was, I when I got in, the wind projects were still just popping up, like you said. Like it was primarily wind, solar. The NCF, the net capacity factors weren't that great. So you would see small residential solar projects back in 2008, 2009, but there were not too many utility scale solar projects that you could really talk about. But wind
Okay.
was really picking up. Wind was really picking up. Wind was very comparable in its NCFs to gas turbines and natural gas based power production. So wind was really picking up, but it required a change in the mindset of you know we are all used to seeing coal fired plants, we're all used to seeing natural gas fired power plants, hydroelectric power plants, and nuclear has gone up and down through the years and the generations. But it was something that people are like, okay, if the wind doesn't blow, then will I not have electricity inside my house? And we can sit here and laugh about those, but those are real
Real
questions,
problem.
right?
Yeah,
Very real questions
absolutely.
for very real people.
Yeah,
And what does, we build in a lot of rural areas. So imagine like opening up the door and seeing a big wind turbine outside your house.
yeah,
Some people like that. I think of those turbines as a gentle giant, but like some people are like, okay, this is so intrusive.
yeah.
So, so it was a very new, it was relatively new at the time. I would not say very new, but relatively new. So my job at the time was, I was from the environmental side, I was looking at permits, right? So we would work with the larger companies. Actually, the company that I work for right now has gone through multiple, changes over the years. And back then, I was actually working for them. They were called Horizon Wind back then.
Okay,
And so I used to work for them as a consultant, reviewing permits that would be required at the federal level, state level, and local jurisdictional levels for them to be able to build the project to compliance. So we
okay,
would call these things called permit matrices, and we would put these permits together. So we would say this is the permit required. This is what paperwork you have to turn in. This is how long the permit is valid. These are the fees that you have to pay for the permit. So I would have to call people up and keep talking to them on the phone, different agencies, and being an outsider, it was really funny because some people would immediately catch on to my accent. We
yeah,
would have a funny little joke about my accent, and then we would go from there. Some would
okay,
be some would be a little taken aback as to why is someone calling me about this? How is this important? So lots of fun conversations. So that was the starting point in some ways. But then I think wind or renewables has gone through its peaks and valleys. So I believe in 11 or 12, it hit like a little bit of a rock bottom there. There were certain financial instruments, there was investments that were going in another direction. Oil and gas had made a pretty massive comeback at the time because oil and gas is also a very cyclical business for the most part. Um, so they had made a comeback, so you could see a little downturn in the renewable side. And then with changes in the political side, wind made another comeback because there's things called production tax credits and investment tax credits, which kind of help in the generation of power through wind and solar assets.
right.
So in the interim, I was very much focused on shale gas. I was doing a lot of work on shale gas. So I've always been in the oil and gas or the power sector throughout my career. And so I spent a lot of time figuring out how deep the wells could be for the shale gas operations. Would you impact an aquifer if you were not casing the well properly? So I spent some years doing that, and that's what led me to my next job. Is there was a drought happening in the country at the time, and people are looking for water engineers who were able to focus on understanding recycling and water treatment. And so essentially from the energy side, I moved from ERM to AECOM, which is a behemoth when it comes to EPC, basically engineering, procurement, construction. So they do a lot. A
Okay,
lot of departments are focused on consulting and engineering. Some of them are focused on providing engineering support, procurement support, and then also just the entire construction. So my wife actually works for AECOM as well. We
okay,
met years before, but
okay,
I think 5 or 6 years ago, she moved to that company and just turned out to just work out that way. So massive company, good company. So yeah, so I spent another 3 years there, very much focused on oil and gas. I worked with the big four
How many
essentially.
years does it take to put up a wind, let's say, a single particular? Just asking out of, you know.
No, 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 no. So I started learning that in 15. So after I finally transitioned to EDPR, and building a wind farm is actually one of the shortest spans.
Okay,
Yeah, yeah, it's crazy. Permitting it, getting all the approvals, and
that is that takes.
getting the power purchase agreement, getting the interconnect with the grid. Those are the administrative side of it. The planning side of it takes a lot of time. I mean, we've had some projects in the pipeline for decades, if you
Okay,
can believe that. Like, I mean, it just is lot, a lot happens. Plus, public perception dealing with that. The construction of the project is primarily, I would say, can go from between 9 to 18 months.
okay,
So,
okay,
I mean, depending on, how many turbines you have, what is the complexity of the ground where we are putting it, foundations are, they're very deep, very large foundations, and the turbines are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So, those getting a supply chain, getting your turbines delivered on site. They have these big, massive trucks and these rigs that are moving these blades across the country. Those things will define how easy or how hard it is to essentially the time period between, could we do it within 9 months? Could we do it between 18 months?
okay,
From my experience over the last 9+ years at EDP, I would say on an average, I would say about 12 months. Um,
okay, okay.
yeah.
And do you think that in terms of design, like you said, one of the problems is that people see this as an intrusion and that it blots out landscapes. So, is there work going on to try and see how this can be minimized, the size of the blades or the overall impact?
So that's perception, right? So that's a tough question because like I personally, like when I drive through, I've been very fortunate. Like I've traveled quite a bit through North America now just because of the sites and how remote they are. I love seeing them. I love seeing the turbines, and I'm also biased. So take it with a pinch of salt.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I would say there are a few things that we do. So, these turbines can cast a shadow, right? There can be a little bit of interference with TV signals, especially like out in the remote areas. You've got TV signals, and there might be a little bit interference with the. So we compensate based on that, right? So if there are studies done, and the energy assessment team spends a lot of time figuring out what the right place to site these are. How we have certain requirements, and they have to be a certain distance away from someone's home.
Okay.
Even with neighboring properties, it's just not that, let's say you and I are neighbors, and I get a turbine in my backyard, it cannot become a problem for you, right? So we have agreements even with the neighboring landowners. So there's a lot of mechanisms that have been put in play to see to it that they are part of the landscape versus an eyesore on the landscape, right? Lots and lots of work done on that front, and that's why I think it takes a lot of time. And plus, I think in the US, because I can speak about the US quite well, even in Canada and in Mexico, what I've noticed is there are lots of governmental instruments that are put in place to check. The FAA, for example, has requirements on how tall they can be, what kind of lights need to go on so that the airplanes can see what's happening when they're landing, how close to an airport can you build. Lots and lots of rules are put in place so that they do not become a bigger problem in the future, right? We don't want to be a penny wise, pound foolish kind of an
Right.
organization.
Right.
So yeah, so there's quite a bit of work, but at the end of the day, if a human being, based on their perception, thinks that it is intrusive, then very difficult to change that. Very
Yeah.
difficult to change.
Okay. Now, in terms of how, generation is one aspect of renewable energy. And when it comes to solar, as long as the sun is up, it's being generated. And when
Yeah.
the wind is blowing, power is getting generated. So I've seen a trend of storage getting to be more and more important because it compensates for the time when power is not being generated. So, do you think that that is going to be another growth area?
Massive growth areas. So we're actually in California right now. We are putting projects in there with storage. So we are doing a lot of co-located storage projects. So with solar, we're doing batteries. So let's say you've got about 200 megawatts of solar being produced, and then on top of that, you put maybe 20 to 40 megawatts of storage, so you can kind of keep sending the power into the grid even when the sun is not shining, right? So, I mean, I think EDP, the company I work for, and for the most part, I can speak for the industry because I've been here long enough. I don't think we are an industry or a company that is saying solely the only way of producing energy is through renewable sources. What we're saying is there has to be a mix. There has to be a mix, and climate change is happening. We're seeing a lot of impacts of it. I personally in Houston, it's a struggle to find insurance for our homes because of all the different, weather impacts that we take. So the climate is changing, and I spent quite a bit of time in grad school studying climate events, and um, whichever side of that political debate you're on, I mean, science is pointing in one way that the climate will keep changing as it has changed over eons of time. So it's more about preparing and adapting to that change, and I think that's where um, the renewable side has a massive, place to play, right?
Yeah.
There are countries in the European Union right now that are able to produce on a couple of 2 to 3 days solely out of renewables, right?
Mm.
I don't think we can just wake up tomorrow and say 100% generation for the whole year for multiple years will be all renewable. So there's a place for every different
Yes.
energy source. Um, but I think overall batteries will really change the game because they will put that influx of energy into the system when traditionally wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining.
Right, right.
But
The
again,
other
it depends.
interesting, sorry, the other interesting thing which I see is that the oil and gas industries, the traditional fossil fuel, as well as the what is that generated from water flow, which is thermal,
Hydroelectric.
no, or thermal power. No, that is
So,
purely wind water. By the generation of streams. If I put water through, generating electricity where there's a flow of water, even
right,
those
right.
I've seen closed systems come in where water's pumped from a long height, I mean,
Yeah,
huge height,
yeah, the
and then
hydroelectric plant. Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
the most
yeah.
basic
No,
hydroelectric.
no, you're good. You're good.
Yeah, for a moment I blanked out on that particular word. So even that. So do you? The interesting thing which you talked about is the mix. So do you think that there is going to be a conflict because in any kind of transition, how do you then decide in terms of policy which one is going to be important to do? I know this is a very very high up in the air kind of thing, but when
No,
you're
no,
working on
good
a day-to-day
question.
basis, I'd like to understand how a renewable energy company thinks of this.
Yeah. So it's a great question, and we all talk about this quite a bit, but just know that not the expert when it comes to policy. So I'll try my best. Okay. So I
Okay.
think everything should be predicated on demand, right? How much demand there is. So right now, where the demand is, surprisingly, where the demand is coming from is data centers, right? The whole
Yes.
world, the whole world is
Yes.
basically, between
Yes.
cloud computing, AI, data
Yes.
storage centers. So there's a massive demand, and plus, I think I'm not so into Bitcoin, but Bitcoin mining is also another
Yes.
area that's picking up,
Yes.
like very energy intensive areas, right?
Yes.
And human beings, I mean, a few weeks ago, we lost power in Houston. We had a pretty massive storm come through, and it kind of destroyed our grid a little bit, and so we lost power for about 4 to 5 days. It was really interesting to see like what we were really focused on powering in the house. So we wanted to power our cell phone, we wanted to power our iPad, we wanted to power our fridge was the only thing that you would go back about 10, 20 years ago and say, okay, the fridge is important. But other than that, everyone, like mom and dad were here, my son, my wife, we were all very much concerned about powering our devices, the new age devices.
Okay.
And so I think that defines where energy is going to be required, right? So we are going to require energy to essentially meet the demand coming out from this new way of how we are living, right? So if that's the case, then you need to have um, a constant flow of energy coming in, right? And if you someone had once very intelligently told me, like, once the electron hits the grid, no one really knows where that electron came from. Right? It could have come from a
Oh, wow.
wind
Okay.
source or a water source. Like, electron is electron.
Smarter.
Like, it doesn't have a different color to it, right? So at the end of the day, I think it's important to understand that that's what the demand is going to be able to define how much energy is required, right? And if you are in a state or in a region or a location that has high wind and high solar potential, right? Because we have all these maps, like globally, we have maps to understand weather patterns. We have maps to understand solar patterns, like the sun's movement and where. So if you can use that to your advantage, that's being human, right? Like, I think, to me, that
Right.
is the most human thing, is to be ingenious and to figure out how can I see to it that there is survivability for the species. So it comes down to demand in my mind, is where is the demand and how do you now, in that mix, there are certain things for sure anthropogenically will impact the climate, right? There is, what humans do, how we interact with the environment has an impact towards it, right? It's basically Newtonian when you look at it from that perspective.
Yeah.
So if there are certain forms of energy that have a detrimental impact, then how do you balance that out with other forms that has a lower detrimental impact? So renewables is awesome because our water consumption is next to zero, right? So we
Okay.
don't need water, right? None of our wind turbines, we don't have cooling towers. We don't require, a stream of water to be running. Even in hydroelectric, like hydroelectric plants have changed the face of the world. And EDP also runs hydroelectric plants in Portugal, and it's a very important part of our business model. But hydroelectric plants, there are so many authors who've written books on the impact it has on communities that used to once upon a time live by those rivers, that have now been made larger for holding the water before it flows down, as you were mentioning. So there, everything has a positive and a negative, and what I think we have to look at as society is how do we do a cost benefit analysis, right, together, without having too many political mindsets, right? Because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is just provide energy for our species to move on, right?
And
So
that,
roundabout answer on that front here.
no, no, it's a well reasoned and thought through answer, because you predicated it on demand as opposed to weighing one against the other, which I think is the way that it should ultimately be seen. But when you started this off, I don't think we saw this coming back in the 90s with the growth of the internet and data and storage. I think very few people imagine that data centers and then Bitcoin would be
Yeah,
the largest consumers of energy. And some of them have even got to the point where small country equivalents of energy are being, sort of used
yeah.
up every month. And I saw that YouTube is actually right next to Bitcoin in terms of the amount of storage power or the power that it consumes.
I'm
All
sure I have
those
a big
numbers
role
add
to
up.
play in the YouTube consumption. I'm probably one of the top people using YouTube. No, so true.
Yeah. So, like you said, what happens inside the house, and what is it that you see as important, and what are the things that we sort of move towards, has changed from generation to generation.
Yeah,
If people didn't have the iPad and they didn't have access to the net 30 years ago, there were
yeah,
other things where it seemed perfectly reasonable to manage with fossil
yeah,
power and hydroelectric.
yeah,
But now that we have all these additional requirements, then, and how do we do it now in a way that doesn't impact the environment as a whole?
yeah,
You're working for a company that has operations across multiple countries.
yeah.
What are some of the changes that you've seen? Because in each of those countries, I would assume that everything is, the demand would be different in some countries which are less developed. There would be a much higher demand in some other countries. The political scenario within certain countries might dictate policy.
Yeah.
So, can you talk of some of the things that you have observed which have struck you as unusual or interesting?
Yeah, no, for sure. It's been a really interesting journey. I love history, so it's been really interesting to understand how, in some ways, we've moved from year to year, but in some ways, we're still the same. We haven't really changed as humans. It's really interesting to watch. Yeah, so I would say right now, if I look at like so, I'll start with North America because I'm part of the North America team, so I kind of see a little bit more on the North America side. So Canada, you can see, you'll go through cycles of the shale. They had the shale sands, the sands where you would get the oils from the oil sands. Sorry, so you have oil sands, and especially in provinces like Alberta, at one point they were extracting quite a bit of oil resources from the oil sands. And then, there was an environmental movement against it because of the impact it had on the ground. And then you saw a change in political leadership here and there, and it kind of we were able to build a project. Some of our projects get delayed because of those changes in policies that happen. I mean, at the end of the day, governments are, for the most part, and should be chosen by people, right? Like
Yes.
government for the people, by the people, of the people, right? So people will make their. You'll see when financial markets are impacted, the people vote a certain way, and you'll see a certain party coming into power. Sometimes it's based on the social side of things. Sometimes it's very clearly based on the financial side of things. So those you will see having a complete impact on how we do business. They can happen at the micro level with projects in certain states in the US. They can happen at the macro level across the whole supply. And COVID was one of the most disruptive events. I mean, to me, personally, because I had to spend a lot of time working on COVID, given my role in safety. It was one of the most exhilarating, events of my life, challenges, opportunities, but it was also extremely disruptive in a lot of ways. And I think we are still only bouncing back. That pendulum went so far on one side in terms of how humanity looked at each other that it's still taking time to come back to where it was in 2019 prior to things going bad. So I think that I've seen in Mexico, there is a big push. I mean, in terms of the governmental changes that happen. I mean, they just had their first woman president brought in, who comes from a Green Party based approach. So obviously they want power to be more of a public. They wanted to see it as more of a public versus a private entity. So there's discussions that happen on that front. Um, we have projects in Southeast Asia where you don't see large scale, I mean, at least we are not in the large scale utility side, but small distributed generation. You're seeing a lot of private companies, your top tech firms, you know, getting into the whole ESG side of things around environmental, social, and governance, and making that a very key metric towards their financial performance and their performance as a company, because the world is asking them, like, what are you doing as an enterprise that has so much financial power? So a lot of different variables, and there's one of the most difficult questions to answer, because um, every country will have its own policies for sure, and they will put in mandates to say we'll get X number of gigawatts or megawatts of renewables. But then there is so much that happens at the micro levels, at the local levels. There's also who's going to buy the power, what are you going to do with it, where does it go? Lots of questions that come from there. So um, I think Europe in some ways, when it comes to renewables, might be a step ahead in some ways. Um, but they also don't have like the large wind farms and large solar farms that we see in North America, because of the land that we have versus the land in Europe. It's a lot more smaller. So, but yeah, I mean, there are some really cool things that you get to see in terms of changes that I think offshore has done exceedingly well on the European side of the Atlantic, and it's just starting to catch ground. And even then, we saw some step backs on the offshore side last year, where some of the companies that had promised to put some offshore farms weren't able to do so because of just political reasons, and also
Okay.
because of permitting issues. Like they didn't get the permits in time, supply chain was supremely disrupted. There was also quite a bit of like nexus from the public opinion side. So very complex to go through that, but happens everywhere. We have a project, I mean, in Colombia, that's impacted by just where we are trying to build it, and how that all works out. So across the global portfolio, you'll see wins and not so good situations. based on the ever-changing, human experiences. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, where are you seeing the jobs? I'm coming more down to earth in terms of people who are listening to this and then saying, okay, young people who are getting into renewable energy,
Yeah.
what should be their focus in their years and while they're studying, and what would you advise them to do?
Okay. Um, so I'll take those as two different questions, like advice to young people versus where the jobs are. So I think the jobs, if you're an engineer, there's tremendous number of jobs, right? In terms of performance analysis, checking the performance of the fleet, managing the performance, analytics, in what I do, safety, security, business continuity, trying to understand resiliency, quality. We do a lot of work within my department on what is the process working the way you intended it to work, or after a few years the process break down? So we
Okay,
we look for industrial engineers who can kind of understand the process flow. On the safety side, I have people who have tremendous amount of patience dealing with people, dealing with their problems. More than any other technical background, I think some of the roles that I look for is more around the personality of the person to be able to handle chaos, right? To be able to handle chaos and not walk away from it, because a lot of what we do, especially like your very first question on how quickly a wind farm or a solar farm can be built, means that everyone has to work together in one direction. And part of the role, at least within my department, is to be able to keep everyone aligned, that we cannot let anyone get hurt. We cannot see to it that we're building something off spec. Those are very important things for us. But across the board, I mean, I've seen engineers go into project development where they are essentially working with local landowners, working with governmental organizations to get the first round of planning done. I've seen young people coming into origination where they're working with customers like off-takers, right, who are taking the power, and working on building out what that agreement should look like. I've
right.
seen young people within my company come in the legal side, on project management, on construction. So a lot of engineers on the civil electrical side coming in as engineers building projects. So I would say right now in the US there's actually quite a bit of a dearth in terms of finding talent. We are struggling with it. I'm part of the American Clean Power Association, and we've actually spent quite a bit of time working on standards and guidelines on what training should look like, because we all had different training setups, and it was really causing a lot of chaos at the industry level. Everyone said, no, I want this person to have X degree or X experience, and the other one was Y. And so we've kind of flattened that all out. But right now, I would say there's quite a bit of demand for just people who would like to venture. Um, and across the board, not just with renewables, across the board, there's lots and lots of opportunities.
Okay. And in terms of the number of jobs, you said that it's growing every year. Would you say there is a fair amount of growth?
So I don't know about this year, but I believe in 22 and 23, renewables was probably in the top five when it came to job generation. So
Okay,
in 22, the Biden government passed the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and that had a very massive mandate around renewable energy and around building projects, with renewables in mind over a long period of time. So there were certain regulations and requirements put in to meet that law, and that generated a massive amount of jobs. So 22 and 23 were just crazy in terms of hiring, and you saw that across the board. I think it has relaxed a little bit in 24, because right now, I mean, everyone's gone and said we're going to build all these projects, so now the rubber has to meet the road, right? So you have to actually
right.
build the projects, because there are investors sitting and saying, okay, you said all this, what's happening, right? So I think there's a little bit of everyone taking a deep breath and putting the projects in the ground. I know we are doing that, and once we get those projects up and running, then the next round of projects, the next tranche will come. All these projects will start coming in, and then you will see people again having another big increase in hiring. But I wouldn't say the hiring has completely gone away for us. I mean, we're still actively looking, um, just a little bit more. At one point, it was just get people in, let's just get people in. Now it's a little bit more specified to where the gap in our, within a program is or within a department is, and then getting the right person for those jobs.
Okay. So, in terms of your job, you mentioned that you're looking at safety, security, quality. What does that involve? Give me a few instances of, let's say, a particular incident, and then how you would respond typically to mitigate the situation or to handle it.
Yeah. So essentially, let's break it into. I would say there are essentially four different departments. So with safety, my focus is primarily on risk. So where do we take risk, right? So we're building projects in remote areas, and some of those projects are each turbine is 300 feet, right? So 100 meters ish. So you have people working at some serious heights. So you've got concerns around what are the requirements of working at height. Plus, I mean, this entire conversation, like I'm in the power industry, we produce electricity, right? So electricity, by nature, is a very dangerous form of energy. So working with low voltage, medium voltage, high voltage, what are the requirements? Um, you know, we use this term called lockout tagout, where you're isolating the hazardous energy. It can be for pneumatic, it can be for mechanical, it can be for hydraulic, but primarily we use it on the electrical side, given our business. And so, you're going into troubleshoot, you're going into maintain. Those require heavy amounts of planning done, and that planning is where I sit in, is planning the safety part of it. Like, how do you approach these with the right kind of procedures, with the right kind of training, with the right kind of personal protective equipment. So we have the hierarchy of controls. Essentially, that's what we use in safety, where we say the first thing we need to do is we need to just eliminate the risk. So if I can
Right.
completely remove the energy, then that is how I want the human to interact with that system, is without any energy. There are some cases where I cannot do that. So can be substituted, can we put an administrative control, can be like a procedure, and or can we do some engineering controls to protect the person from having any detrimental impacts from working on that system. And then lastly, when we can't do anything else, we put a bunch of gear on the person. We put a lot of personal protective equipment, and then we let them go. So for example, like climbing a turbine, and I've climbed quite a few in my life. I mean, just the climb by itself, just getting ready for the climb takes about 20 to 30 minutes, depending on
Oh, okay.
how often you do it. So, like for someone like me who doesn't climb that often, but climbs, you know, fairly here and there. I mean, it takes about a good 15 to 20 minutes. I'm going to put my harness on. I'm going to put, my lifeline connectors on. There are lots of colloquial terms, and I don't think the audience will understand that, so I'll stay away from it. So, a bunch of gear goes on me before I'm even ready to climb up. And then, depending on the height of the turbine, it can take, someone from, I've seen some technicians who can just fly up and fly down. Like, they're just so good at it. They're very, very strong guys. And people like me, it might take between 15 to 20 minutes, depending on, how I'm feeling that day, how tall the turbine is. So by the time you get on top, you're already tired. And the one thing that you need to understand, like the human body doesn't like to be tired. So I think there's a recent study that came out, like when the heat is high, we actually say smaller words because we can't even say bigger words because our
Okay.
brain hates it, right? So
Don't process it
imagine like
as
going up tower, huffing and puffing, and then having to do complex maintenance tasks and complex troubleshooting tasks that deal with medium voltage and high voltage in some cases. So that's where the safety comes in. Security for me is more around physical security. So we see issues with, theft, vandalism. We see the U.S. Unfortunately, you've probably heard about this quite a bit, Mama, in terms of the gun culture. There are certain impacts that we have to be prepared for, be ready for. So that's where the security part comes in. It's relatively new for me in terms of handling it. So I'm still building that whole thing out. So it's physical security and not cyber security. There's a whole other department that focuses on cyber security, not physical.
cybersecurity.
And
Okay.
then quality is and again, quality can be broken down into like 5 or 6 different smaller streams. But essentially, what we're saying is we're building our sites to the contractual obligations, and we're building our sites to the technical specifications. So we're very much focused on that. And then overall, every company has tons of processes. For example, like when you put this podcast together, you go through a list of, you have a checklist of things that you go through, right? Tomorrow, let's say one of those processes is not panning out and is not giving an efficient result, then you kind of, that's how I get involved, is oh, I'm not getting an efficient result. What do I need to do to build up that efficiency? So one part of the department focuses heavily on quality. And then lastly, business continuity. So this part came about after the pandemic primarily. Prior to that, we would do it from an operational risk perspective, just to kind of see if tomorrow something bad were to happen, a pandemic or a catastrophic event, that we are prepared to keep the business running. But slowly and steadily, like after the pandemic and the role we played during the pandemic as part of what we did, we slowly moved that department globally for us at EDP within the safety, security, and quality side, because we were able to very quickly analyze, and I think we got trained. It was trial by fire for us during those years
Yeah.
on how to build up resiliency within the company. So, if a catastrophic event happens, who are the key people to deal with? What decisions do we need to make? What are the communications that have to be sent out? There's a very complex methodology behind business continuity. And again, it's new to me. I'm still learning. I'm in that learning phase right now. So the first thing we did was we actually turned the lens on ourselves and said, you know what, first things first, let's figure out whether the safety side of our business is resilient. So if tomorrow something were to happen, are we prepared to handle the challenges? So
Okay.
that's kind of what we focus on heavily.
Okay. So your journey over the past 17, 18 years, starting with being a volunteer at Down to Earth and now being a director at the company level, you've literally transitioned through several levels within the organization, between the sector itself. So, when you look back, which do you think was, I wouldn't say rewarding, because it's a very difficult thing to take one particular point in time and then say, hey, this was a great phase. But what do you think is the change between Prashant who started off versus the Prashant of today?
Wow, such a thoughtful question. I think what I would say for me, the and I think everyone from my generation would say this, would be the pandemic. So
Okay.
2020 and 2021. If I were to pick one event, right? So to your question, like it's very difficult to pick one event, and so every day, every year of my professional journey, I was very fortunate to be surrounded by very smart people. There were days when I would be sitting, starting off as a staff engineer, sitting in a room where I had five engineers who cumulatively had 20 years each, so 100 years of experience is what I was surrounded by. You can't pay for that kind of knowledge and education.
Yeah.
So I mean, so I had lots of rewarding moments that way, but handling a pandemic which no one ever prepared me for, no one ever prepared a lot of us for,
Yeah.
and every day we were changing, and I think we were used to the hustle and bustle of day to day life till we realized that life by itself would be redefined,
Okay.
right? And so March 16th of 2020, or I think March 15th of 2020, everything's okay, right? Like I still remember, like I was talking to my colleagues in Lisbon, and they said, listen, we are hearing about this stuff coming out of China. Just to be careful, can you just go buy these masks? So I'm thinking, okay, why am I spending money on masks? Can you imagine, like that was the thought process in Jan of 2020. And I was like,
Yeah.
no, I mean, I'm surrounded by very smart people, and if they tell me that they're seeing something, there's probably something to it. So at the time, we bought one mask a person. That's what I did. I bought one mask a person, and we basically created this stockpile, and we put it into our little, storage room inside the office, saying, worst case scenario, every employee will have a mask for themselves across the board. So I think at the time it was about 600, 700 masks is what I bought, and they were dirt
Okay.
cheap at the time, right? Come March, the whole world changes, and then by March 16th, I'm at the forefront of shutting down the office, trying to make plans to see how we would operate our assets, who could interact with each other, and then one second, the kids are making a little bit of noise. Okay?
Yeah. One moment. Yeah. Help us.
So I remember where I stopped off. So come March 16th, shutting down the office, reaching out to the operating sites and telling them, okay, there's a new way of operating. What can be maintained? What can be not maintained? What is troubleshooting? I mean, I remember getting questions where we were shipping these large FedEx boxes because we were getting parts and supplies, and people are like, "Can I touch the box? Will I get COVID if I touch the box?" Right? Do I need to spray the box down and clean it? We couldn't. I mean, I remember working with a site up in Washington State where they were able to work with a distillery to convert their supply chain line, their supply line, their assembly line from I think liquor to creating hand sanitizer because the
Sanitizer.
alcohol
Yes,
content, right?
yes, yes.
So the biggest joke in my office right now is like at the time I had to run and buy all this hand sanitizer stuff, and one of them literally smelled like pure undiluted alcohol. I mean, they were like, "Are you trying to get us drunk at work?" Because I mean, it smelled nasty. But I mean, there was nothing else to even like. There was nothing else, right? I mean, we worked with one of our manufacturers that makes bags where we put tools in the bags, and we had them change their assembly line to build masks. And the
Okay.
only colors they had were pink and orange. So then you had all these big guys walking around wearing pink masks, with a beard popping out from underneath it. It was just. I mean, sometimes when I
Now you
think
can
about it,
look back and laugh, yeah,
just
but not
laugh.
then.
Yeah, and I had my own family, so I made my wife and my son. They moved in with her sister, so I could just. I mean, my day would start at about 4 o'clock in the morning generally, and I'm an early riser, but that was another level. So 4 o'clock in the morning, you would start planning, 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 and you never knew what the day brought you. And we were running crisis management meetings daily, weekends included. We were basically I had to, you know, talk to the leadership team on a daily basis. There were impacts to our construction timelines, there were impacts to what our supply chain was looking like, impacts to people. And then once the spread started to happen a lot more in terms of the infections, then my job became more around contact tracing. Oh, you were on site, you started coughing, you had a sneeze. Could you have impacted someone else? So it was very difficult in a lot of ways. And being trained as a classical engineer for the most part, I'm very used to analytical thinking. So 1 plus 1 should be equal to 2. And why I look at that period of my life is I very quickly realized that human beings don't actually follow the 1 plus 1 equal to 2, right? What you might think is a risk at work might not be a risk for you at home, right? You might not want to
Right.
come and interact with people at work, but you are interacting with your neighbors around your neighborhood. So while you're still interacting with people, and who am I to judge and say that is okay and this is not okay? It's just human, yeah. So
Yeah.
I I, I had to build, which is one of the hardest things for me was I had to build empathy within me, and Mama, like that was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do because I was never trained that way, right? Like I never thought, or I was never in a situation where I had to do that. And I think this is not just for me, but a lot of people that were in situations like I was in, maybe even all of us as, the people of the world, we should have probably picked up some of that during those years. Hard to kind of look back and say, but that was the most challenging time of my life because I had to do everything I told you. Plus, I had to become, the internal CDC, my company's CDC, and people send me emails about I don't feel safe and I don't like this and I don't like that. I had people telling me they wanted to wear masks and other people saying they didn't want to wear masks and some wanted to vaccinate and some didn't want to vaccinate.
Yes.
So it was something else.
And you were handling it literally on the forefront because those decisions would come up to you and then you had to figure out. So that's the point at which I think people saw so many shades of human behavior. You saw the selfless aspect as well as the very selfish aspects.
Yeah,
You saw people who were willing to go the extra mile and people who wanted to hoard only for themselves.
yeah,
So I think you got the two extremes of human behavior and you were subjected to this on a daily basis.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
and this was one point when the entire world was impacted. So it's not as if you stayed in a particular place, you were immune to it.
yes,
It's just that you got to see it, straight up front, and you bore the brunt of it. Now, when it comes to so post the pandemic, has it do you think that you're better prepared, or do you think that the world can still throw a curveball, which because you're seeing climate change and you're seeing things happen which let's say 20 years ago may not have happened at all. So, what are the things that you believe could happen?
Wow. You're asking me some really tough questions, some really thought-provoking questions. I not to be. I'm a very optimistic person in general, but I will say this. During the pandemic, when I was working through it, I had these moments where I could go back and study, previous events that had happened because it helped make decisions as I was doing them on the fly. And there were certain, and hopefully this is all true and it's not just the internet telling me that it's true, but I saw newspaper cuttings from 1919 during the Spanish flu, right? That
Right.
literally verbatim were what we were going through in 2020, 100
Oh,
years apart, right? Same
yeah.
thing around masking, same thing around vaccination. And that by itself was also a very similar respiratory, infection. And so I believe that humans by nature will somehow or the other come back to that point,
Yeah.
and the times that you're in will define how you work through it, right? I mean, think about it, right? Like, I mean, we have wars happening in Russia and Ukraine. We have wars happening in Palestine, and Israel. Um, 1,000 years ago, we were still fighting. I mean, that hasn't really changed. I mean, we're still fighting, and maybe we're a little bit more sophisticated in the tools we use, but I mean, we're still doing that.
Basic
So
human nature doesn't change.
yeah, I mean, so like I'm just being a very realist on that front. And
Yeah.
when it comes to that question, is do I see something like this happening? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, but I think some of the models that we should look at is, I think Singapore is actually a really good model to look at. At least from my reading, that's what I took away, having not been there and having not studied them, like researched them, just having read a few things. When they had SARS and they fought through SARS, I think it impacted a lot of their decision making during COVID. So, they were not, they didn't push back as much when it came to certain, universal mitigation steps, as you saw in Western countries, which was strange at the time. But I
Yeah.
think some of their actions and some of how they dealt with situations, is a response to what they learned, right? So I think that is important, and I do want to say that while we as human beings have the propensity to do the same things again, maybe 100 years apart, there is also what I've seen, pockets of lessons learned and what to do with it, right? So there is hope there. I think, I mean, if you were to look at me and ask me the question as to what do you see the big issues coming up in the future, um, I think geopolitical issues in terms of, where we are right now, like some of the wars that I've talked about, they do have an impact on society. There is quite a bit of that that's impacting how the world is working. I mean, I think when the first war began between Russia and Ukraine, it had immense impact on gas prices, across the European nations. There was also the need for European nations to stock up on certain natural gas supplies during those times, just because they want to be prepared for the cold weather, because they were getting gas from Russia at the time. So I mean, I think there is quite a bit. I mean, when the Israel-Palestine conflict started, part of the solidarity led to, um, fighting happening in the Suez Canal or in those areas where you saw a lot of, ships being attacked,
Yeah.
and those ships were carrying a lot of goods, so they can have impact on, the projects that we're building, steel prices. So I think right now, I think just very myopically, like just looking very short-sighted, I think the geopolitical issues and in terms of political structures, who becomes president of which country, I think they play a pretty important role these days.
Yeah.
Um,
We'll,
I won't go. I won't go into it in detail, but
yeah,
yeah,
we'll have to sort of leave it there, Prashant, because
yeah,
I think we're coming to the end of that particular. Thank you for a wonderful session because
yeah,
we've covered a lot more than renewable energy. But thank you for taking part and for telling us what a career in renewable energy means.
yeah,
Thank you.
for sure. Thank you so much, Venu. To all your listeners, like, thank you for listening, and all the best in your journeys.
Thank you. That was Prashant Krishnan from EDP Renewables, and he talked about what a career there means. Next week, another guest, another story. Stay tuned.